The Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members do not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. And as a reminder, if members want to insert a document into the record, please email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. Before we discuss today's hearing, I would like to take a moment to remember our colleague, Congressman Donald Payne Jr., who passed away a few weeks ago. It was a privilege to work with Donald as my counterpart on this subcommittee. It was clear to all who knew him how strong his commitment to public service was and to his constituents. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have worked alongside Donald, especially with his leadership in putting together our bipartisan pipeline safety legislation. He will be deeply missed here on the committee, and I want to send my condolences and prayers to his family, friends, and staff as they deal with this great loss. I will now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. Today's hearing, we will examine the need to reauthorize the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, including providing it new direction and authority over emerging energy sources. This past fall, myself, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and Ranking Member Payne introduced H.R. 6494, the Promoting Innovation in Pipeline Efficiency and Safety Act of 2023, or the PIPES Act of 2023. Last December, the committee passed H.R. 6494 out of committee on a bipartisan basis. In crafting this bill, the committee solicited input from a wide range of parties and in turn received about 90 priorities, 90 of them, from members and over 100 requests from pipeline safety stakeholders. I'm grateful for the support from members of this committee in putting together this important piece of bipartisan legislation. In our country, roughly 3.3 million miles of onshore pipelines safely and efficiently carry natural gas, crude, hydrogen, hazardous liquids, and other energy resources vital for our nation's energy independence, making it the utmost importance for Congress to ensure PHMSA is focused on its core mission of advancing the safe transportation of these resources. The PIPES Act of 2023 reauthorizes PHMSA for 4 years and provides the necessary resources and direction for the agency to fulfill its pipeline safety oversight responsibilities in an efficient and effective manner. The bill contains several provisions to accomplish this, including an authorization for additional pipeline safety technical experts to complete outstanding congressional mandates. Over the past 20 years, more than 1,400 excavation damage incidents have occurred. H.R. 6494 includes measures to strengthen state programs to reduce the number of excavation damage prevention incidents, promoting the public's safety. The PIPES Act of 2023 will also support PHMSA's efforts to oversee the safe transportation of new and emerging fuels by directing PHMSA to update regulations for the safe transportation of carbon dioxide and to study the use of hydrogen blending in natural gas. These and other provisions in the PIPES Act of 2023 will ensure the safety and reliability of the United States pipeline network and the transportation of our critical energy resources. It is more important than ever for PHMSA to receive a regular reauthorization from Congress. This will provide both the agency and regulated community much-needed certainty in federal pipeline safety policy and also provide legislative direction to addressing pressing areas of concern in pipeline safety. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and sharing their perspectives on pipeline safety reauthorization and what it means for PHMSA, the industry, and the communities where the transportation of our energy products take place. I will also note that my colleagues on the House Energy and Commerce Committee have also passed pipeline safety reauthorization legislation through committee based on their jurisdiction. Despite such action in the House, we have yet to see any movement in the Senate from Leader Schumer and his majority. As the House has shown, it is possible to legislate in a bipartisan manner in the name of pipeline safety. I call on the Senate to follow suit, and I hope to work with them in the near future. I will yield back and now recognize Ranking Member Wilson for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Nails, for holding this hearing today. And thank you, Ranking Member Larson, for your faith in me. It is with a heavy heart that I take on the role of Ranking Member of this subcommittee. Congressman Donald Payne Jr. was not just a colleague, but a cherished friend whose legacy I'm dedicated to honoring and advancing. His exemplary leadership on the Railroad Subcommittee sets a standard of excellence that I'm committed to upholding and building upon. For many years, we were soldiers in the Army to uplift Black men and boys, whether that be Trayvon Martin or fighting for health disparities among Black men and boys. He fought the good fight to bring back our girls from Africa. I sat next to him in committee for years, and we were table mates every year at the Congressional Black Caucus Gala, and he shared many memories with me. He was so proud to be the father of triplets and to let me know that he married a Florida girl. I will miss him, and I'm committed to honoring his legacy and continuing his work on this committee. As we all know, part of his mission was to ensure the safety of all people, and he had a goal of never wanting to miss a vote, regardless of his health. And speaking every day on the floor to honor his constituents, he loved his constituents. He was a man for all seasons, and we will miss him dearly. Before coming to Congress, I was a school principal, and nothing is more important to me than the safety and education of our children. I do not want to see any pipeline incidents, but I'm particularly concerned when they occur at or near a school. At least 2 recent incidents in the last year happened at or near schools. One was near an elementary school in Conway, Washington, and another was at a school in the Mississippi Delta in Marigold, Mississippi. Yes, believe it or not, just last month in Marigold, there was a pipeline explosion at Hayes Cooper Center, a pre-K through 8th grade school. Although no children were injured, 2 school staff members were injured and taken to the hospital for treatment. I want to know how pipeline operators work with communities and schools to prevent such incidents. Are they working with the impacted schools for additional tutoring or student support for those children's lost instruction time? What about their mental health? How does having to evacuate impact students' learning? With regard to the PIPES 2023 bill, I supported the bill because it has essential provisions that Mr. Payne championed, and I associate myself with his work on these efforts. Among them, the bill includes increased funding for the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to support the Office of Pipeline Safety for its critical safety mission. I am proud that this bipartisan pipeline safety bill strongly focuses on pipeline safety. This bill also makes changes to the Competitive Academic Agreement Program to provide funding for academic research and develop the pipeline safety workforce of the future. The changes will help most historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions participate in the program. These are positive changes, and I urge Congress to adopt them. Lastly, I want to say to Mayor Kaag of West Reading, who is leading her city through the aftermath of this deadliest pipeline explosion the country experienced in 2023. Thank you for watching today. I'm so sorry for your loss. 7 people died after showing up for work to make chocolate. 10 people were injured, and I understand in your volunteer firefighting capacity, you also showed up to help with the immediate emergency response. We hear you, we see you, and we will never forget. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back my time.
The general lady yields. I now recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Nels, for calling this hearing on pipeline safety and for your kind words about our colleague and friend, Representative Don M. Payne, Jr. And we continue to mourn today after his death just 2 weeks ago. Don was a leader on the PIPES Act of 2023 that our committee voted unanimously to advance in December. He strongly supported ensuring PHMSA and the state pipeline safety programs have the funding they need to do their work. Don also helped lay the groundwork for strong rail funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Because of Don's work, we will see replacements of century-old rail bridges and tunnels on the Northeast Corridor, including the Sweet Gateway projects. He was a friend and advocate for rail workers, supporting their bid for sick leave, higher wages, and improved working conditions. His efforts helped support a historic agreement that would strengthen the safety and quality of life for essential rail workers. Don's work to advance rail safety legislation, especially in the wake of the derailment in East Palestine, will remain an important part of his legacy that Congress must continue to realize. On June 10th, 1999, an Olympic pipeline explosion in Bellingham, Washington, in my district, claimed the lives of 2 10-year-old boys and an 18-year-old young man. The explosion also released 237,000 gallons of gasoline into a creek that flowed through Whatcom Falls Creek in Bellingham. This explosion, at the time, spurred my commitment, which has been steadfast for over 20 years, to the highest level of pipeline safety. For my entire tenure in Congress, I've fought to reduce the risk of pipeline incidents, promote transparency of pipeline safety information for local communities, and increase accountability for pipeline operators. And according to PHMSA data, in the past 20 years, there have been 12,722 pipeline incidents, claiming 278 lives and causing $11.4 billion in property damage. So while we work on the PIPES 2023 bill, the pipeline industry continues to experience deadly accidents causing damage to the environment. According to the Pipeline Safety Trust, 2023 was the deadliest year for pipelines in 2 decades. On March 24th, 2023, a UGI pipeline explosion in West Reading, Pennsylvania, killed 7 people, injured 11, displaced 3 families from a neighboring apartment building, and evacuated many more from the area. In November 23, as well, Third Coast Infrastructure released 1.1 million gallons of crude oil from an underwater pipeline into a, quote, unusually sensitive area, unquote, in the Gulf of Mexico, about 20 miles southeast of Venice, Louisiana. More recently, in January 24, 2 homes less than a mile from each other in Jackson, Mississippi exploded 3 days apart from Atmos Energy pipeline leaks. The first home explosion resulted in 1 fatality and 1 injury. The resulting fire from the second explosion spread to a neighboring home. These incidents happened after Atmos had identified leaks in their pipelines in the area but failed to repair them. Putting safety first means greater oversight and accountability of the activities of pipeline operators. It also means greater transparency for local communities and the public. PIPES 2023 accomplishes this by creating an Office of Public Engagement, an idea championed by my Washington State colleague, Representative Strickland, and requires PHMSA to review operator emergency management response plans. Improving safety means preventing incidents. PHMSA and the state pipeline safety programs need the resources and staff to inspect pipelines, conduct investigations when incidents occur, and take appropriate enforcement actions. PIPES 2023 does this by increasing the authorizations for both PHMSA and state pipeline safety organizations. And I'm pleased that our bill includes $56 million for state pipeline safety programs over 4 years. I appreciate each of our witnesses being here today to talk about the PIPES Act of 2023. I want to welcome PHMSA Deputy Administrator Tristan Brown, who visited my district to tour the Olympic pipeline site in Bellingham, and Bill Karam of the Pipeline Safety Trust, whose organization was created in response to that tragedy and is headquartered in my district in Bellingham. I also want to thank PHMSA and the response to the Conway, Washington pipeline leak that happened last year, and cleanup continues but nears the end for that. In addition to its safety initiatives, the BIL created the first ever natural gas distribution infrastructure safety and modernization grant program. And PHMSA has announced $588 million for 167 projects from the $1 billion made available to municipalities and community-owned utilities to repair or replace natural gas pipelines and help reduce incidents and improve safety. Pipelines play a critical role in the nation's infrastructure and the daily lives of Americans. We're here today to make sure the National Pipeline Work safely delivers energy across the country. I look forward to today's discussion. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Larson yields. Thank you, sir. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Obviously, green, go, yellow, you're running out of time, and red says conclude your marks, please. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral arguments to 5 minutes. Mr. Brown, I appreciate you handing me the book, the 2024 Emergency Response Guideline. 2 million of these going to first responders. Well done, but I have an issue. And before I recognize you for 5-minute testimony, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege. Without objection, so ordered. The committee notified you on April 15th of 2024, it's 21 days ago, that today's hearing was taking place. You also have been asked for feedback on the Pipes Act far longer than that. And we, on a bipartisan basis, re-asked for this on February 7th, so that's 90 days ago, 3 months. Yet, you were unable to provide your written testimony to this committee in a timely fashion, denying all of the members of this subcommittee the ability to adequately review your testimony. Your agency was also unable to share feedback on the bill until last night after 10 p.m. I find it completely unacceptable and inexcusable. Now, due to your delay on both fronts, many members may have questions following the hearing as well. And I want to make sure it expects a full answer. We want a full answer from you to all members' questions today. I'd also like you to commit to responding to all members' questions for the record. So give me a reasonable expectation here. Can you commit to providing an answer, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Could you give me a number?
Well, as you may know, both the TA and the testimony does go through an interagency review process, which does take time. So I will commit to working as fast as possible.
2 weeks or 3 weeks? Just come on, give me an idea. Okay, so we're not going to, okay, here we go. I look forward to your responses. We here on the subcommittee are interested in what you have to share. You can't come up with a time. I look forward to a productive hearing. I hope we can have a productive hearing. With that, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee, for the invitation to discuss the Office of Pipeline Safety at PHMSA and our work, as well as the reauthorization legislation that you've put together. I just wanted to start by echoing the sentiments and condolences to the Payne family, to those of you who are colleagues, to those of you who are friends, to the Payne office and staff members, who I know were all as saddened as I was to learn of his passing. It is a testament to his legacy that he worked across the aisle this past year to help advance legislation to improve pipeline safety and to keep his constituents and all Americans safe from hazardous materials transportation. As I testified last year before this subcommittee, safety is and remains the top priority of the Department of Transportation and of PHMSA. Specifically, PHMSA is responsible for overseeing the safe transport of hazardous materials through pipelines and via other modes of transportation. That's trucks, trains, planes, vessels, automobiles, drones, among others. We oversee the safe design, operations, and maintenance. As the chairman mentioned, nearly 3.3 million miles of pipelines, as well as nearly 1 in 10 goods that are classified as a hazardous material, transported commercially in the United States, everything from nuclear waste to lithium-ion batteries to spacecraft being transported to spaceports around the United States and around the world. Nearly 2/3 of the energy we consume in the U.S. is transported via pipeline. And over the past few decades, especially the last few years in conjunction with America's red-hot economic growth, energy production in the United States has continued to increase to record levels. Concurrently, U.S. transportation of these products has necessarily increased, and exports of energy products have also reached record levels. This means heightened demand on our pipelines and refined product storage infrastructure, as well as export facilities, liquefied natural gas terminals, which PHMSA also regulates. The volume of work before PHMSA and the challenges in carrying out our safety and environmental mission have never been greater. Aging infrastructure requires more maintenance and greater safety scrutiny. A significant portion of the cross-country pipeline infrastructure was built shortly after World War II, meaning pipelines are over 80 years old, and there are even a few gas distribution segments that were installed during the Civil War era, more than 150 years ago, which, thanks to the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, we are finally modernizing through our first of its kind, as Ranking Member mentioned, Natural Gas Modernization Grant Program that we stood up last year, which included grants in multiple districts of multiple members of this subcommittee. With increasing challenges and broader demands on our agency, clear direction and resources from Congress are important, and particularly as we close out the final few congressional mandates from the 2020 Pipes Act. PHMSA is grateful for the work that this subcommittee has done in advancing bipartisan legislation, including increased authorization levels. In closing, I would like to thank you again for the opportunity to discuss with you the critical issues facing our agency, as well as our state partners in the largest, most sophisticated pipeline system and hazardous materials transportation system in the world. Each of the areas I outlined in the written testimony are areas in which the rest of the world looks to America for leadership. Leadership in the marketplace of products, for which we are the most efficient in the world, in leadership for establishing safety rules that countries around the world have told me they often adopt in whole to improve their own pipeline safety and environmental protection. Leadership in the rule of law when it comes to disputes and compliance. Leadership in research, innovation, and new technologies to improve safety and environmental performance that are sold domestically and exported around the world. Leadership in transparency and engagement with affected communities, which other countries also look to as a new standard. And leadership in efficiencies for all the work that we do. This work is the result of our collaboration with the congressional committees that authorize and fund our agency, as well as the stakeholders represented here. But the kudos, most of the kudos for all the achievements of our agency go to the nearly 650 full-time and federal employees and nearly 200 contractors that make up what I always say is the most unsung agency in the government. Thank you for your efforts to advance bipartisan reauthorization legislation. I look forward to working with you and your colleagues as Congress considers a pipeline safety reauth bill and honors the efforts of your colleague, Mr. Payne. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Sames, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Nils, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Christina Sames, Senior Vice President for Safety, Operations, Engineering, and Security at the American Gas Association. Prior to AGA, I worked in research and development at Pipeline Research Council International and spent 12 years in public service working for the DOT's Office of Pipeline Safety. I get to officially retire next month after a 34-year career dedicated to pipeline safety. I'm proud to have made a difference, and I guess I should thank you all for this retirement gift of putting me in front of a hearing. Thank you. AGA represents more than 200 utilities that deliver natural gas to 74 million customers. Natural gas pipelines deliver essential energy to 177 million Americans through 2.5 million miles of pipeline system, including 2.2 miles of local distribution system, operated by natural gas utilities. The natural gas utility distribution pipelines are the last critical link in the delivery chains that brings natural gas from the wellhead all the way to the burner tip. So basically, AGA's members are the face of the industry. They live in the communities that they serve. They interact daily with their customers and state regulators who oversee pipeline safety. and their customers are their neighbors, their family, and their friends. As such, pipeline safety is and must be our #1 priority. The primary safety tool that gas distribution operators use is DIMP, Distribution Integrity Management Program. DIMP is a regulatory process that allows an operator to develop a safety plan that addresses the unique operating characteristics of the individual pipeline system and prioritizes the work to strengthen that particular system. Upgrading distribution pipeline systems is also an important pipeline safety component. Currently, 43 states and the District of Columbia have expedited pipeline replacement programs. And in just the last 17 years, these replacement programs have allowed operators to reduce the amount of cast iron and bare steel by over 50%, replacing those lines with plastic, which will increase safety, reliability, and limit methane release. The natural gas distribution industry has proved it can simultaneously increase natural gas delivery and improve safety, but more needs to be done. AGA believes that the provisions within the committee-passed bipartisan Promoting Innovation in Pipeline Efficiencies and Safety, PIPES Act of 2023, will substantially improve pipeline safety by limiting deaths, serious injuries, property damage, and environmental impacts caused by unintended excavation damage, strengthening criminal penalties for those who sabotage and intentionally damage pipeline operations, studying how natural gas, hydrogen blending, and distribution systems worldwide are safely operated, creating a voluntary information safety system to collect and share best practices and lessons learned with sufficient legal and regulatory safe harbors to guarantee industry participation, and establishing a 4-year reauthorization period so that PHMSA and the industry have sufficient time to complete work authorized in previous reauthorizations. While not in the bill, AGA strongly supports creating a regulatory process to identify technology alternatives that, if utilized, will meet the intent of existing pipeline safety regulations and provide equal, if not greater, levels of safety. AGA and its members support fact-based, reasonable, and practical updates to pipeline safety legislation that build upon the lessons learned and the evolving technologies. And in that spirit, AGA looks forward to our continued work with this committee, as well as the Health, Energy, and Commerce Committee and the Senate Commerce Committee to finalize pipeline safety reauthorization. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Rourke, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your oral testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Wilson, and esteemed members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. I'd like to start by offering my condolences on the loss of Ranking Member Payne. My thoughts are with his family. My name is Robin Rourke, and I'm the Vice President of Midstream Policy at the American Petroleum Institute. On behalf of API, we appreciate the opportunity to testify as part of this important hearing addressing pipeline safety and the reauthorization of the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Every day, our nation's network of more than 500,000 miles of transmission pipelines transports the oil, natural gas, refined product, and low-carbon energy that fuel American life. America has led the world in reducing carbon dioxide emissions over the past 2 decades, even as our industry has made the United States the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas. The air Americans breathe is cleaner because of innovative improvements to the way energy is produced, transported, refined, and consumed. But we need pragmatic, bipartisan energy policies that support the reasonable development of our nation's oil and natural gas resources, including policymaking that encourages investment in critical energy infrastructure like pipelines. Pipelines, one of the safest, most environmentally responsible ways to transport energy to consumers, are in every U.S. state, and our industry is committed to zero-incident safety culture. Even as barrels delivered and pipeline mileage continues to increase, this strong safety record is improving. Over the last 5 years, total liquid pipeline incidents decreased 23%, with 87 fewer incidents in 2023 compared to 2019, while incidents impacting people or the environment decreased 7%. We welcome effective policymaking to continue to build upon this progress and further improve pipeline safety. We applaud this committee's passage of a comprehensive bipartisan bill, the Promoting Innovation in Pipeline Efficiency and Safety, or PIPES Act of 2023. The bill the committee passed in December of last year contains many important policy measures that API is confident will make our nation's pipeline network safer and more reliable. In particular, we're pleased the bill requires PHMSA to execute a more timely and frequent review process for industry standards that are incorporated by reference into PHMSA regulations. There are more than 650 references to API standards in federal regulations. These standards are revised and improved every 5 years at a minimum through API's American National Standards Institute accredited process, and regulators struggle to keep pace with the advances in pipeline safety technology and modern engineering practices that are regularly incorporated into these standards. Today, approximately 50% of the instances where PHMSA cites API standards are out of date and do not reference the most recent addition. If passed, this bill would ensure that PHMSA is responsive to industry standards updates to maximize safety and ensure regulations keep pace with advances in engineering and technology. The bill also directs the Secretary of Transportation to allow pipeline operators to establish storage tank inspection frequency on risk-based engineering principles, advances pipeline safety through the creation of a voluntary information sharing system, strengthens protections for pipeline infrastructure by criminalizing activities that cause a defect in or disrupt operation of a pipeline, and encourages innovation and investment in a cleaner energy future by requiring PHMSA to promulgate rulemakings for CO2 pipelines, as well as the safe use of composite pipe materials. The bill also recognizes the important conservation efforts that pipeline operators have embraced. API believes this bill would make our nation's pipelines safer and more reliable, but we know you share jurisdictions with other committees, and conversations on reauthorization are ongoing. We urge you to continue advocating for the provisions I've mentioned, but also to consider supporting language introduced by other committees that would reauthorize a technology pilot program and provide clarity as to what agency regulates in-plant piping at refineries. As a final matter, our industry is actively engaged in the regulatory process to help PHMSA craft a workable final leak detection and repair rule, but we believe the initial proposal went beyond the scope of what Congress intended. We appreciated the letter Chairman Graves and Chairman Nels sent to PHMSA last year, raising many similar concerns, and as we await the final rule, I urge you to continue to conduct oversight of this process. This rulemaking demonstrates the significance and impact of the reauthorization process, and we appreciate the opportunity to participate in the discussion of the bill on the table today. In closing, let me stress that pipeline safety is not a partisan issue, and our industry needs effective legislation to meet the challenge of answering ever-growing energy demand while advancing safety and leading the world in emissions reductions. API appreciates the opportunity to engage in today's hearing and the committee's important work to advance a bipartisan pipeline safety bill. Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement, and I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have today.
Thank you, Mr. Karam. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee, for inviting me to speak today. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Ranking Member Payne. Representative Payne was a great leader with whom I feel lucky to have worked. He will be missed, and my heart goes out to his family, friends, and colleagues. My organization was formed after the Olympic pipeline tragedy stole the lives of 3 boys in Bellingham, Washington in 1999. The U.S. Justice Department was so aghast at the negligence of the pipeline company and the lack of oversight from the government that they asked the courts to set aside money from the settlement to create the Pipeline Safety Trust as an independent national watchdog. Our vision is for no other community to endure the senseless grief that Bellingham had to experience from a pipeline tragedy, though sadly there have been many pipeline tragedies and disasters since Bellingham. Since this subcommittee held its last pipeline safety hearing about 14 months ago, 24 people have died from pipeline failures in the United States. In fact, 2023 was the deadliest year for pipeline safety in America in at least a decade. I stated before this subcommittee that we were not making progress on pipeline safety, and I repeat that statement today. Total fatalities, total incidents, and significant incidents show a statistically flat trend line with no real progress. I'd like to share a few stories of recent pipeline failures that highlight some of the roadblocks towards safer pipelines. In Bellingham, Washington, we are planning, along with the families of the 3 boys who died in the Olympic pipeline tragedy almost exactly 25 years ago, a commemoration of that horrendous day. Just a few months ago, amid this planning, the pipeline failed again, this time spilling 25,000 gallons of gasoline just 500 feet from an elementary school. Thank goodness it wasn't during school hours and didn't ignite. This failure was likely due to corrosion, which an effective integrity management program should eliminate. Over the past 20 years, regulators and industry have focused on reducing failures through integrity management in high-consequence areas. The theory is sound. Focus efforts where the most harm to people and the environment could occur by identifying all potential risks in those areas and mitigate those risks. Unfortunately, integrity management programs do not seem to have lived up to their promise. Incident rates within high-consequence areas are as high or higher than those outside HCAs. Just last month, the same carbon dioxide pipeline that ruptured in Satarsha, Mississippi and sent nearly 50 people to the hospital in 2020 failed again, this time in Sulphur, Louisiana. Luckily, this happened when residents who lived less than 500 feet from the failure were not home, or this could have been another tragic story. It took Denbury, now owned by ExxonMobil, more than 2 hours to arrive and close the manual valves, which is entirely too long. Beyond the regulatory shortfalls of carbon dioxide pipelines, which I included in my previous testimony, this incident raises another important pipeline safety priority: rupture mitigation valves and the ability to promptly close valves. The NTSB began calling for rupture mitigation valves in 1970, continuing with a formal recommendation after the fatal PG&E pipeline tragedy in San Bruno, California in 2010. And that recommendation remains open today because PHMSA is unable to require existing pipelines to upgrade their equipment due to congressional limitations. Congress needs to require operators to install these valves in high-consequence areas. There have been many pipeline failures turned to tragedies by an operator's inability to close valves promptly. And just weeks after last year's hearing on pipeline safety before this subcommittee, a pipeline explosion at a chocolate factory in West Reading, Pennsylvania, killed 7 people, hospitalized 11. According to a preliminary report by the NTSB, the point of failure was likely a service tee made from DuPont Addle A plastic. The NTSB published a report highlighting problems with Addle A plastic service tees in 1988. PHMSA listed these problematic components in a voluntary advisory bulletin in 2007. At what point do we go beyond voluntary recommendations and make it explicitly illegal for this material to be part of our nation's pipelines? The common theme among the pipeline disasters I've shared today is Congress and the regulators leaving too much up to voluntary or performance-based efforts. It's important to offer flexibility to enable industry leaders to make new advancements. However, the regulations also need to ensure that the entire industry is operating safe pipelines. Please remember the 24 people who've died from pipeline failures since the last time I testified before this subcommittee 14 months ago, and think of the empty seats at their family dinner tables. I can tell you from working with the families in Bellingham who lost their sons in 1999, the pain never goes away. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for your testimony. We will now turn to the panel for questions. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Last December, this committee passed the Pipes Act of 2023 on a bipartisan basis, which provides PHMSA with a 4-year authorization and congressional direction for federal pipeline safety policy. Unfortunately, while we continue to work to advance this legislation, the authorization for PHMSA expired in September of 2023. Can you each briefly describe the effects of a lack of authorization and what benefits does reauthorization provide? And I'll start with you, Deputy Administrator Brown, and then we'll go down the panel.
I'll be real brief just to make sure you get to everybody. There's no direct effects, but obviously having the requisite resources to oversee the additional product moving that we oversee and the direction that we get every few years of what is most important to this body, this subcommittee, and the larger chamber and body of Congress is very important to our work.
Ms. Sams?
Thank you. In my opinion, not putting forward reauthorization actually limits PHMSA in some regards. They're in a holding pattern. We need to see what occurs with legislation. And I believe are a little hesitant to move certain things forward until they get the full direction of Congress. There are some great things in reauthorization, at least that this committee proposed, that I truly believe will improve pipeline safety, especially in regards to excavation damage prevention and additional grant funding that will incentivize states to enact leading practices. I think with the change of direction, PHMSA can continue its great role of moving pipeline safety forward. We're hoping it comes soon.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrer.
Similarly, we hear from our members regularly that certainty is absolutely critical so that they can make the investments that they need and then operate their businesses. Having regular reauthorizations, making sure that PHMSA fulfills the obligations from past authorizations provides that level of certainty so that our companies know where to invest, what kind of technologies to invest in, what kind of practices to invest in. So providing that certainty and that clarity is critical to ensuring that we have the reliability and efficiency that that customers expect from us.
Thank you. Mr. Karam?
While prompt reauthorization of the agency is of course important, I think what's more important is the safety advancements that are made in that legislation, more than the promptness of the reauthorization.
I think it's fantastic. The House did their will. I mean, we had a bipartisan bill that's been sitting on Chuck Schumer's desk for months, and he's done nothing with it. And I don't know when he's going to do anything, if anything at all. They seem to be very dysfunctional over there. So I would like to ask, excuse me. Where is my, Ms. Sams, we talked a little bit about the, Ms. Sams, we talked a little bit about the Pipes Act of 2023, and you mentioned it a little bit about reduce the excavation damage incidents. We talked about that. What is the impact of excavation damage incidents on the gas distribution systems?
It's the leading cause of our incidents. Well, that and vehicles hitting pipelines. If you look at the statistics, and unfortunately on excavation damage, it's going in the wrong direction. Yeah. So if I look at like the 20-year trend for serious incidents, 20-year trend, we were at 24.6% of all incidents being excavation damage. If I jump to the 3-year trend, it goes up to 28%. If I go to significant incidents, the 20-year trend is 33.6%. If I jump to 3 years, it's now 42.4%. So for the distribution industry, our focus is really on how do we reduce these excavation incidents. I believe PHMSA's done a great job with helping to create the Common Ground Alliance and implementing 811 call before you dig and providing grants, but it's not enough. So we really need some additional incentives for states to adopt leading practices. And then honestly, we need really good enforcement at the state level for those that aren't, where it's cheaper for them to hit the pipeline instead of calling before digging.
And I agree with you, and I think the Pipes Act of 2023 addresses some of those issues. Thank you. I yield back. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you. Mr. Karam, do you think that pipeline operators are doing a good job of supporting the communities where there are accidents and incidents?
No operator wants their pipeline to fail, so nothing is intentional. But I think when we look at the long-term trends, as I mentioned in my opening remarks on fatalities, on total incidents, on significant incidents, and the fact that those trend lines are statistically flat, I don't think that we're making sufficient progress in keeping our communities safe.
Do you know how they engage with schools and other members of the public?
Yes, there is. I think public engagement has been an area where the industry, the regulators have all fallen a bit short, but there has been progress made recently. There's been a new recommended practice on public engagement that was put together by a working group under API, and it's just recently been adopted, and it outlines some great best practices for operators to share information and how to engage with the people around the pipeline, with schools, and everyone affected by the pipelines. I hope that operators will incorporate that and that we will see an improvement in public engagement. But right now, I think we're seeing a lot of poor public engagement across the country.
Okay. The National Transportation Safety Board identified that at the tragic UGI pipeline explosion in Reading, Pennsylvania, there was an older service tee erroneously still in use made from a material Adelaide that PHMSA identified in 2007 as having a poor performance history. Is this PHMSA's way of saying that pipeline operators should get rid of pipelines with that material?
Yes, yes, but it is a voluntary advisory bulletin, and it was also recently incorporated into a proposed rule on distribution systems to look at Adelaide service tees in the DIMP program and the distribution integrity management. But again, that is performance-based and leaving it up to operators. So there's been a lot of encouragement to find all of the Adelaide in systems and the service tees and remove them, but it has not been mandatory.
Do you know what operators said they would do about using this material, and what have they done about it?
I think operators have been looking for it. This product was installed in pipelines many decades ago, and record keeping may not have been what it is required to be now. And so there is a challenge in finding every instance of this service tee in a system, but I believe it is the operator's responsibility to find it and remove it.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, Mr. Karam outlined the devastating personal impact to the loss of life from pipeline incidents and accidents. What is the economic impact to communities where there are pipeline accidents and incidents? I'm particularly thinking of West Reading, where the chocolate factory was one of the town's largest employers. That loss will have a severe long-term economic impact to the community. What is the economic impact?
Well, I know everybody here has seen the tragedy that can occur like the one that you referenced, and the impacts can be myriad. Of course, first and foremost, the impact on families and loved ones and community members. I was just in Jackson, Mississippi, where with Congressman Thompson and meeting with the community there that was affected by a tragic fatality. There's a lot of concern, and people wonder if they, their systems are safe. Businesses can lose access to, energy supplies. There's the impacts are myriad. So I applaud the committee's work in trying to identify those impacts. I've certainly, when we see a loss of a system that people rely on for energy, there are many direct and indirect impacts.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize my colleague from the great state of Texas, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and want to thank the witnesses for being here. Deputy Administrator Brown, the PHMSA is far behind schedule in completing the idled pipeline rulemaking, which, as you know, is required by Congress to be promulgated by the end of December of 2022. PHMSA should not continue to regulate idle and fully active pipelines the same. Idle pipes do not carry hazardous materials, as you know, and they are disconnected from sources that allow for transporting hazardous materials. So the regulation should be appropriately tailored to reflect the reduced risk of incident. Regulating idle pipelines the same as active pipelines means that PHMSA is directing precious and limited resources here when the funds could be much better used implementing other regulations. So you joined us, Administrator Brown, for a hearing on reauthorization last year, and in your responses to questions for the record, you indicated that PHMSA intends to issue a proposed rule in the first quarter of this year. This has come and gone. I ask you, why has PHMSA still not completed this rule? Is there an updated timeline for completion that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah,
briefly.
at the committee's direction and the Congress's direction, we update on a monthly basis all of our rulemakings from the 2020 Pipes Act. I believe that one is slated for later this year. I'll be perfectly honest with you, though. You gave us 36 mandates in the last reauthorization bill. That's compared to 19 mandates in the previous reauthorization bill. So we had almost double the number of directives from you. And so we continue to triage the directives with the highest safety impact to reduce safety risk to the American people first. And so that one is on the list of priorities. It's just lower than the high-risk rulings that we're working through.
Mr. Rourke, would you elaborate on the impact that the idle pipe rule will have on our industry and is having on our industry?
Yes, sir. And we've been very vocal as an association, and you've heard quite a bit from our industry, I'm sure, Representative Babin, about the challenges associated with permitting for new pipelines, even doing some work on existing pipelines. Those permitting challenges are not going away. This being able to, right now there are two categories, as you pointed out, active and abandoned pipe, and that abandoned pipe has to be pulled out. Getting this classification for idle pipe would allow companies to leave the pipe in the ground so that they can come back and use it together. From a safety perspective, they purge the line, they clean it, they fill it with inert gas so that it rests there harmless, and it is monitored, but it doesn't take the same required resources that you pointed out earlier. But if we're going to continue to operate this infrastructure in this country without building more, then we're going to need all the pipe that we've got.
Amen. Thank you. One more question for you, Mr. Brown. In the 2020 Pipes Act, Congress mandated that PHMSA updated safety regulations governing large-scale LNG export facilities. The last time you appeared before us here at the committee, you mentioned that it was a high priority, and yet the proposed rule has still not been released yet. Again, timeliness seems to be a problem with you in PHMSA. Why has PHMSA still not completed this rule, and what's the status of this regulation?
Yeah, well, I'd echo my earlier answer, but I'll just add that in your home state, we had one of the largest exporters of LNG experience a 400-foot high fireball, an explosion at that facility. Luckily, no one was killed. We want to learn what went wrong there and include it in the updates. And that is part of the reason we're continuing our investigation of that incident, but we want to include the lessons learned from that incident in that rulemaking.
Okay, last question. As you know, PHMSA may reimburse states for up to 80% of costs incurred by states in enforcing pipeline safety laws and regulation. Given that Texas is far and away the leading state in terms of total pipeline miles, we're spending more than any other state to meet these safety standards. Unfortunately, Texas is receiving significantly less than the authorized 80% reimbursement. I just want to put this on your radar as an issue if you are not already aware of that. I'd also like to encourage your team to work with both the Railroad Commission of Texas and Texans on this subcommittee, myself and Chairman Nels, to ensure that we can get this fixed with a long-term solution that doesn't leave the nation's #1 energy producer in an unsustainable financial situation. And so if you can get in touch with our team, send us the requested information about the things that I've asked, I certainly would appreciate.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Chairman, if I can just respond with a thank you to Congress. Just a few weeks ago, the FY24 appropriations bill included a big boost for the state program grants. So we anticipate getting a boost in funding to the state of Texas along with the rest of your states. So thank you for that.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize a valued member of this subcommittee, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Back in May of 2018, the Merrimack Valley, homes just started exploding across several towns. The gas pipeline was overpressurized, dramatically overpressurized, and literally explosions started coming out of people's houses. An 18-year-old, Leonel Rondell, was killed. And I worked with my Massachusetts colleagues to update pipeline regulations. My colleague from Texas has just made the same point, but why is it taking so long to just get these rules finalized? I mean, any day another accident could happen. You just talked about a 400-foot fireball in Texas. Why the delay?
We follow the Administrative Procedure Act, and then we also follow the statutes that govern us, which includes an additional advisory committee review, which includes 5 public interest representatives, 5 industry representatives, 5 state government representatives. That takes an extra many months to work through the highly technical issues involved in these regulations. The other thing is that we regulate thousands of operators, each with unique systems. So creating a one-size-fits-all rule is very difficult. It usually means we end up in the courts because one entity doesn't like what we do, or a small group of entities don't like how we are directing operators to operate. So those are just a few of the big challenges we have, but the obvious one is resources. That we had, we started off with 2 regulatory attorneys working on rules like the one that you directed us to do, Congressman. We've doubled that as soon as the administration took office, and we've set record number of rules in the first year that we got here, but there's still a backlog, and so we appreciate this committee's support for additional resources, for additional rulemaking team members.
Okay. The last PIMSA reauthorization included a provision requiring the Secretary of Transportation to submit a report to Congress about the need for an independent pipeline testing facility under DOT. My understanding is that PIMSA is the only, essentially pipelines are the only major mode of transportation that does not have a dedicated research, testing, evaluation facility. Has PIMSA finalized the report, and do you know when it will be delivered to Congress?
We are part of the way through in that report. It has not been finalized. We do fund nonprofits that do some of that pipeline research testing through the funds you authorize as well.
Can you give us any idea of what the timeline is? Partway through does not sound encouraging.
Yeah, I would suggest a matter of months. We have had discussions with folks on both sides of the aisles and multiple committees on that. I think there's varying interest in the subject of creating a facility, but we look forward to getting you that report.
Can you give us some indication of what the findings or recommendations will be?
I have not seen a draft yet.
That's not encouraging.
But glad to provide you an update as soon as we can.
Okay, shifting topics for a second. Integrity management programs are the primary tool that pipeline operators use to ensure the safety of their pipelines. Does this work? Is it a good system?
We've got thousands of operators, and it's certainly working well with some, and I think certainly not with others. And so coupled with our push, this committee's push, the stakeholders here's push for pipeline safety management systems, where you are constantly looking and challenging your own presumptions and where risks may be, I think there's a lot of promise. I think we welcome the constructive criticism of where it might not be working. That's really fundamental to a safety management system, is that you're always looking for, well, what are we missing here? And with integrity management, because systems are so different, it is hard to write a single prescriptive rule for the disparate systems across the country.
Do you feel that it is the right approach, or should we be taking an entirely different approach?
I would say all that is just one approach that we have, but we're investing in research. We issue safety advisories. We issue directives, emergency orders when needed. So I think there's promise. It's what I think the rest of the world does use a lot of this, a similar non-prescriptive regulatory scheme. But we want to use just any tool in our tool belt to address safety risks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, with regard to the leak detection and repair rule, when will the agency release the final rule, do you anticipate?
Our monthly update suggests, I think, by the end of the year.
Will the White House and CEQ be involved in reviewing this rule, the rulemaking?
Through the interagency process, every agency will have an opportunity to provide feedback in doing that. In the proposal stage, I think there was minimal involvement. Really, the input comes at the advisory committee stage, where we've got input from a lot of the stakeholders here to try to build consensus around that rule, which we have largely been able to do.
Is the agency working with the EPA to harmonize this rule with new EPA methane regulations, since there will be overlapping requirements?
Yes, we did that at the proposed rule stage. As you know, sometimes the rules don't align perfectly from a time standpoint, where you have a proposed rule that you might be working on, but you're waiting on another agency to propose their rule. So we are harmonizing, though, to try to minimize overlap between our agencies.
Is it the position of the agency that all leaks are hazardous?
I was just in Jackson, Mississippi, where a non-hazardous leak resulted in the death of Clara Barber. So we are highly concerned about the potential for a non-hazardous leak to become hazardous, but not all non-hazardous leaks are hazardous.
Mr. Rorick, in your written testimony, you highlight concerns that API and the industry have with PHMSA's leak detection and repair notice of proposed rulemaking. Specifically, I noted that your testimony explained that PHMSA exceeded the scope of the language in Section 113 of the 2020 Pipes Act. Can you elaborate on that?
So we believe that PHMSA and the proposed rule went beyond what Congress mandated them to do, specifically going into rural gathering lines and LNG facilities in those two particular areas. And then consequently, by doing that, particularly for the rural gathering lines, you're pulling in areas that would then dilute. Someone mentioned the comment or concern earlier about PHMSA diluting their limited resources. That would certainly do it. And there's the potential of missing more significant releases in more densely populated areas.
May I address that question?
Sure,
briefly?
absolutely.
Thank you very much. I just want to add that at the advisory committee meeting just last month, there was a unanimous vote on the inclusion of those rural gathering lines that included the industry vote, and with a lot of nuance around how that would impact those lines.
I know that PHMSA is required to conduct a cost-benefit analysis for all its rulemakings. Any comment on how you think that will play out?
Yes, sir. If you look at both, and I think that we would probably disagree with the deputy administrator a little bit on the overlap with EPA, where EPA looks at flow rate, this proposed rule would look at concentration threshold. So there's some conflict there with the EPA rule. But if you add in the low threshold, it would effectively remove a lot of the opportunities that current operators use to maintain and look for these leaks. So they would effectively have to walk their lines with handheld meters. And then if you pull in those rural gathering lines, that's an extra cost and burden there. And I don't know that their cost-benefit analysis looked at the safety and the environmental benefits associated with items such as those.
With that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this very important and timely hearing. I, too, want to take a moment to recognize the passing of former Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Congressman Payne. I hold the utmost respect for him and his leadership displayed time and time over the years. He will be missed. Moving to the topic of today's hearing, we've heard from my colleagues about the importance of pipeline safety. Indeed, safety should be the #1 priority when transporting materials like CO2 and odorless asphyxiant that can be deadly if improperly managed. And that's exactly what we should be concerned about as we look to the future, especially as industry looks to dramatically expand our network of carbon dioxide pipelines. Mr. Rorick, American Petroleum Institute's testimony boasts about the safety of pipelines. Your testimony states that the industry, quote, has been operating CO2 pipelines safely for more than 4 decades with no fatalities. But a CO2 pipeline rupture in Sartasia, Mississippi, caused 45 people to be hospitalized from CO2 poisoning, where people lay on the ground, shaking and unable to breathe. It was lucky that this tragedy didn't end worse. Mr. Rorick, yes or no? Does that sound safe to you?
There are certainly risks associated with it. That was a tragic incident. No, that's an incident that we would like to have avoided, sir. I'd like to go into more details, but you asked for a yes or no.
Thank you. Let me give you another example. Just a month ago in Sulphur, Louisiana, an estimated 107,000 gallons of CO2 leaked from a pipeline owned by ExxonMobil. Local police and firefighters could do nothing than set up roadblocks and wait for the pipeline's owner to repair it. It took more than 2 hours to repair, and many residents were never notified of the leak. Yes or no, does that sound safe?
The incident occurred, but that doesn't necessarily mean the pipeline wasn't safe, sir.
My final question, Mr. Rorick, how much does CO2 pipeline developers stand to profit from these pipelines?
I'm not in a position to answer that, sir. You'd have to ask those individual operators.
Well, since you're not sure, I'll tell you that in the Midwest, Summit Carbon Solutions, the largest proposed network of CO2 pipes in the nation, could be eligible for up to $18 billion in tax benefits for their project. That's just one company. It's apparent that there are dangerous gaps in federal regulations that keep people safe and huge economic motivations for the companies that want to see these pipelines built. Leak notification systems, detection methods for odorless CO2, and emergency responses plans are nowhere near built out. We should be putting a moratorium on all CO2 pipelines until we can ensure that people, especially ones in vulnerable communities where these are built, will be protected. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Stallberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brown, the class location rule allows pipeline companies to employ modern inspection technologies to prove the safety of existing pipelines when population changes occur nearby instead of outdated, expensive, and environmentally unhelpful methods. We've talked about the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee that convened a meeting on class location rule and voted overwhelmingly to meet again on the rulemaking within 12 months. Can PHMSA commit to holding the next GPAC meeting on the class location rule before March of 2025?
We were able to hold that meeting, Congressman, a few weeks ago, and we completed the work on that rule.
Thank you. So, Mr. Brown, how many barrels of oil, I'm from Minnesota, how many barrels of oil do we produce annually in Minnesota?
Not familiar with the state level of that.
Zero. That was, I just wanted to share with you something that concerns me. How many total miles of pipelines in the United States totally?
Roughly a little over 3 million.
How many miles of those pipelines are involving oil and gas?
Involve oil or gas, roughly 3 million.
Total?
Total.
So if the Biden administration gets their way of removing oil and gas industry, would that be down to 0 pipelines then?
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow. Could you repeat the question?
If the Biden administration gets their way of removing oil and gas industry from the United States, would we be down to 0 pipelines?
I'm not familiar with any proposal to do such a thing, and in fact, the number of pipelines has increased, I believe, 17% in the transmission space over just the last few years, 13% overall in just the last few years. So, and then with record investments in new emerging technologies, hydrogen, CO2, there's potentially a continued expansion there.
Right. You have a very impressive background. So would you say the technology in the pipeline safety and the enhancements thereof have done very well in the last 10 years?
Absolutely. The technologies are incredible.
Ms. Sams, congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you, sir.
This may be one of your last meetings you testified, but again, thanks for your service and thanks for your knowledge. Would you agree that because really the safety for the pipelines is a bipartisan issue, and we want that. Would you agree that the technology involving the safety within the pipelines has greatly been enhanced in the last 10 years?
It's greatly enhanced over the decades I've been in service.
Mr. Rourke?
Yes, sir, but leaps and bounds.
Mr. Karam?
Yes, there's been a lot of great technological advancement on pipeline safety.
So one of my concerns I have is we always talk about pipeline safety on both sides of the aisle. And we have what I would say is unlawful people, valve turners trying to damage pipelines and what have you. Does everybody on the panel agree that those terrorists that damage pipelines and cause union members to be in danger and the public to be in danger, do you all agree that they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law because the danger they're putting us all in? Mr. Brown, we'll just go right down the line.
Should terrorists who threaten or damage pipelines should be prosecuted
To the full extent of the law?
to the full extent of the law?
Mr. Sames? Ms. Sames?
Absolutely agree.
Mr. Rourke?
We would absolutely agree, sir.
Mr. Karam?
Yeah, we don't support the any creation of an unsafe condition like that on a pipeline.
Thank you very much. And I just want to thank you all for coming and sharing your testimony. You know, as being on the full committee of T&I, this really, a lot of these issues are bipartisan, and I think that we need to recognize the safety issue. It affects us all, and I'm really thankful that the chairman brought this meeting together today to talk about the safety issue, which is the number one issue that we're discussing today. And Mr. Chair, I thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. And just for note, our bill that we passed here does strengthen the penalties for those that want to create that terrorist act in our pipeline. So the gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses. Thank you, in particular, Mr. Karam, for speaking some important truths about the inherent dangers and risks of this spider web of combustible infrastructure that we rely on to power the fossil fuel economy. I think there is too much fossil fuel business as usual in this country, certainly in this conversation about continuing to build out this system that is frankly a disaster waiting to happen every day. And it does happen just about every day. I heard about a fireball in an LNG facility just now that I had never heard about before. It pretty much doesn't even make news because it's just the cost of fossil fuel business as usual that we have come to accept. I feel like by passing a bill that doesn't do nearly enough to acknowledge this, much less do anything about it, we are sleepwalking further into the climate crisis and further into tragedies and disasters. Now, you don't have to look far to find examples of this. Over the last 12 years, the Keystone pipelines had 22 oil spills, including 2 large spills between 2017 and 2019. Then again in 2022, it spilled an estimated 14,000 barrels in Nebraska. And because of these issues, the GAO issued a report in July of 21 regarding Keystone Pipeline's safety record, which included a shocking revelation. The Keystone, with this terrible record, was not an outlier. It has about the same safety level on average as pipelines all over the country. This, taken with Mr. Karam's testimony, showing that 2023 was the deadliest year for pipeline safety in America in 20 years, should be a red flag. It's a clear sign of how concerned we should be by the state of our pipeline infrastructure, and especially by this increased build-out that we are sleepwalking toward in this committee and in this Congress. Now, sadly, another example of the significant threat pipelines pose can be seen with the failure of the Denbury Gulf Coast Pipeline in 2020. This exposed the community of Satartia, Mississippi, to dangerous levels of CO2. When it ruptured, it took just a few minutes for residents to feel the effects. 50 of them went to the hospital. A significant number are still suffering effects today. Now, these accidents and failures are not outliers. We are continuing to see the same problems from the same entities everywhere we look. Just last month, there was another CO2 pipeline leak from a pipeline owned by Denbury, this time in Sulphur, Louisiana. So, Mr. Brown, after Satartia and that CO2 pipeline disaster, PHMSA found that Denbury made a lot of mistakes. They significantly underestimated the size of the affected area, did inadequate monitoring, took too long to notify officials. One would hope that Denbury would have been closely monitored and scrutinized by PHMSA to make sure that these findings were corrected for. But sadly, it appears that many of the same failures occurred with the Sulphur, Louisiana leak. Apparently, Denbury was unaware of the failure. It took hours to arrive on scene, and if this leak had occurred when residents were in the area during the day, it could have been catastrophic. So, are there any failures or lessons learned that PHMSA identified and informed Denbury about, now they're owned by ExxonMobil, of course, to correct after Satartia? And in reviewing the aftermath now of the second incident in Sulphur, Louisiana, which of these seem to have gone ignored or unaddressed?
I can note that there are numerous directives that we provided to Denbury after the first incident. We're still in the investigative phase of the second incident, which can take some time. We also applied those lessons learned, which I know you had asked me the last time I was here about, to a proposed rule that we hope to have out in the next few weeks to create the strongest standards for CO2 pipelines.
I think we all look forward to seeing that rule. Look, we have only about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines right now, most of it in rural areas. Thankfully, when something terrible happens, as it will continue to do, we've not yet seen major population centers affected. However, there is tremendous pressure now to build out this network. I think it is inevitable that incidents like Satartia and like Sulphur, Louisiana, are coming to more populated areas in the near future, and this committee, unfortunately, is sleepwalking into that fate. With all of this pipeline boosterism, not only worsening the climate crisis, but taking us further to these tragedies, we haven't even talked about the blending of hydrogen into natural gas pipelines. I don't have time to go into it, but there's far more that needs to be talked about, that needs to be addressed, and we need to be worried about in this committee if we're going to be serious about pipeline safety. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for South Dakota.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, as you know, the PIPES Act of 2020 implemented a new technology pilot program. This was to allow people to try some new technological innovations, obviously to increase safety. I can imagine all kinds of situations where inline inspection or leak detection innovations, we would want those brought to market or to the field rather in some sort of a pilot program. When you were here last, I thought we had a good, productive conversation, and I just want to pick up where we left off there. It's my understanding that we still don't have anybody utilizing that pilot program. So have you all had any applications?
Yeah, well, thank you for your constructive question last time and directive, really, and offer to work together. We had some constructive discussions after that with stakeholders. You know, the goal is to get new technologies deployed that produce environmental benefits. We have laws that still apply to us unless you tell us they don't apply to consider environmental benefits. As far as I've heard, there's no interest in avoiding consideration of environmental benefits, right? Everybody wants that because new technologies tend to produce environmental benefits. So it's just making sure the laws align and how to do it efficiently to consider those environmental.
So do we have any applicants to use the pilot program?
Well, the program hasn't changed. We sought feedback from the public. We didn't get feedback from the public, but we did get feedback in this committee that said, you know what, from stakeholders, we don't find this sufficient because we have to consider the National Environmental Policy Act analysis in the utilization of that program. And so really we're just discussing, well, is there another way to consider those environmental impacts so that we can more quickly adopt technologies? We're glad to work with you to address that.
So you're saying that the pilot program as currently outlined in law does not provide any meaningful benefits to operators?
Nobody has used it yet, correct.
So what do we need? I mean, we know that there are these innovations. Presumably, we would want to test them in the field in a pilot program so we could get good data about their efficacy. How do we get that done if not through this pilot program?
Well, I think, I would leave it up to some of my colleagues here to answer, but our goal is the same goal that you have. We don't want to just use the American people as guinea pigs here, right? We want to make sure there's an equivalent level of safety and that there are not new environmental costs to the public, right? So I think everybody is on the same page of what we're trying to get at, and the question is just how to do it.
And again, that's why it's great we've got this panel of experts, and Mr. Rourke, I'll go to you next to kind of get a sense from you. Number one, if their innovations do exist, and number two, how best for us to deploy them in a manner, as Deputy Administrator Brown said. But Mr. Brown, how do we get that done? You said that's the question. That's the question I'm asking.
Well, how you currently do is you demonstrate an equivalent level of safety to us, and then we could issue a special permit that would allow you to deviate from existing standards or regulations. So there's actually a current way to do it, and then Congress devised a third way, which is this pilot program. But using that pilot program, you still have to analyze the potential environmental impacts.
Sure.
Right, and the question was, well, do you have to analyze those environmental impacts? And I think we heard, and maybe in Mr. Rourke's testimony, it says, no, you don't have to examine the environmental impacts. Well, actually, I think most of your members say, well, we want positive environmental impacts.
So you
just don't
talked
wanna
about
examine
people
them.
making these filings to be able to get clearance to put into place a new practice. How common are those filings with PHMSA?
They vary widely, so.
Would they be monthly, quarterly, annually?
For specific technologies, they're not frequent.
Okay. Mr. Rourke?
So I think that right now, the way the program is designed, it's just too onerous and too cumbersome for companies to participate. So if we're going to be able to bring these technologies into the testing phase, as you identify, Representative Johnson, I think Congress is going to have to provide a pathway for PHMSA to deviate away from their special permit process so that we don't get bogged down in NEPA and some of these other procedural processes that PHMSA currently has with the program.
I would just say this, and thanks for the colloquy, sir. But Deputy Administrator, for 4 years, Congress has been saying that they want to make it, that they want these new technologies brought to bear so that we can get a safer and better system. The fact that for 4 years, PHMSA has not figured out a way to work with partners to get that done obviously means we've got some work to do, and I guess I would ask for urgency within the agency and within the Hill for us to get that done. And with that, I would yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Kane, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. And before I begin, I just want to add my voice to those who mourn the loss of Congressman Payne. He was a tremendous leader on this subcommittee and also for all things New Jersey. So my prayers are with him and with his family. My first question is to Ms. Sames. Pipeline safety technology is continually adapting and improving. However, sometimes it takes a while for federal agencies to catch up and allow new operations or technology to be used. What challenges have you seen with getting new technology approved?
No, I think we just discussed some of them. With the current program at PHMSA, it's unbelievably burdensome for new operators to apply for the use of new technology. The other issue that I see, though, is when a new technology comes to the market and is proven, but isn't allowed due to the current regulations. Let me explain. And I'll give an example. So right now, PHMSA's regulations require an operator to put a bollard or basically a device in front of a meter to protect that meter. And that was appropriate back in the 70s when the regulations were created. However, and the reason you put that in place is so that if the meter is hit, it doesn't release gas. You don't want gas to be released. But we now have breakaway technologies and excess flow valves that if that meter is hit, it immediately shuts off the flow of gas. But an operator can't use that technology because PHMSA's current regulation requires an obstacle be put in place to protect the meter. I would love to see PHMSA look at how can current technologies really be used to meet the intent of a regulation in a different way. Use these new technologies, they're already proven.
Thank you. Deputy Administrator Brown, the Pipes Act of 2020 required PHMSA to issue safety regulations for pipelines considered in an idled pipeline status by December 2022. And the Pipes Act of 2023 follows up on this mandate and requires its completion within 180 days. What is the status of this regulation, and when does PHMSA anticipate completing this ruling?
Congressman, we provide monthly updates on the status. I believe that one is slated for the end of the year. But as I stated earlier, we have more rules than we have people working on them. We had twice the number of directives in the Pipes Act of 2020 than we had in 2016. So the additional resources in the bipartisan legislation you're considering will be very helpful in helping us helping us get that rule completed.
Do you believe that an updated idled pipeline rule will increase pipeline safety?
I think we had some good commentary that addressed that. I have not looked at, I can't really comment on a rule we haven't written yet. We'd have to lay out that justification.
Mr. Rorick, the Pipes Act of 2023 includes authorization of a voluntary information sharing system at PHMSA. From your perspective, how much participation would a VIS system see from pipeline operators?
If designed appropriately, Congressman, which means proper information protections, providing a system where companies can submit information and there's no reach-back authority in a punitive fashion, I believe companies would actively participate in it. I think this committee was wise to design a program that was modeled after other successful programs like the program that exists for pilots with the FAA. So I think you would get good participation, sir, if designed appropriately.
And what pipeline safety outcomes do you envision once a VIS system is established and operational?
Yes, sir. We do a lot of work right now looking at data, whether it's prevention data or what have you, investing in technologies. This would provide some data of both incidents and near misses that may occur so that we can, as an industry, and working with the regulator, monitor trends, but then also look at individual reporting data to see what sort of learnings we can gain from those as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to join my colleagues in recognizing the loss of our colleague, Donald Payne, Jr. He was an incredible warrior for the city of Newark, the county of Essex, the state of New Jersey, and for so many across this country. To me, he was not just a colleague, not just a friend. He was a mentor and a big brother on both T&I, on Homeland Security, and in this institution, and I will miss him dearly. And I trust that our colleague, Representative Wilson, will do an incredible job picking up the torch and carrying it forward, as we will all strive to do on the work that my friend had done for so long. So just appreciate that opportunity. Today marks 3 years since the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline. This attack led to a temporary disruption in the delivery of gasoline and other petroleum products across a large swath of the country. As cyber attacks continue to become more sophisticated, the need for a strong, coordinated effort to reinforce our government and key assets cybersecurity remains a top priority. We have a particular interest in this topic, as we also sit on the Cybersecurity Subcommittee on the Homeland Security Committee. Mr. Karam, can you discuss how cyber attacks impact our pipeline network, the safety of our pipelines, and the security of our country overall?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I will say that cybersecurity, I think, poses more of a risk to reliability than safety, but there are safety issues at play anytime a system is taken over by someone outside the operator who can close valves, which leads to pressure waves and things like that. It could create unsafe conditions.
And would you want to elaborate on the reliability component that you mentioned?
Well, reliability is outside the scope of the Pipeline Safety Trust. I think the operators could probably speak to reliability better than I could.
Fair enough. And just expanding on that, how can Congress ensure the security of our nation's pipeline network, specifically with respect to cybersecurity?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of best practices out there, and agencies doing that kind of work. Again, it is beyond the scope of the Pipeline Safety Trust to work a lot on cybersecurity, but it does, as I mentioned, pose safety risks, and so we are concerned. But yeah, I believe there's agencies out there outlining best practices, and we'd hope that they're regulated in that way.
Sure, thank you. Mr. Brown, last time you testified before this committee, we discussed PHMSA's coordination with other agencies such as TSA to address cyber threats. You mentioned that PHMSA was seeking to hire cyber experts despite the lack of jurisdiction over cybersecurity. How has that process been going in terms of onboarding, hiring cybersecurity experts?
Yeah, well, we do train the TSA. We actually engage at a senior leaders level. In fact, we have an upcoming meeting with the TSA administrator and leadership from CISA, as well as the pipeline sector leadership. We don't have specific authorization, so it may be something worth considering for the committee to hire in that space. But that is something that we'd like to continue to make sure we are on top of, even though we don't have direct jurisdiction in cybersecurity. It obviously, the nexus really is that a cyber incident can affect operations, or it has the potential to. And so, as you mentioned, the Colonial incident, that was what we were most worried about, both on the startup or restart of the pipeline, as well as in the current, when a pipeline is already operating. In that case, they voluntarily shut down. So we provide that training to the TSA and provide input on their directives, and we would just want to continue to work as closely as possible. I'm glad to work with you if that's something of interest to the committee or as you consider reauthorization.
Great, thank you. And is PHMSA pursuing any additional steps to ensure our pipeline network is prepared for future attacks?
We engage on a voluntary basis with the regulated entities to discuss. We do regulate control room management, which are highly IT-focused operations. And so we have robust engagement post-Colonial pipeline incident.
Great, appreciate that. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too miss our friend who's passed away. I always enjoyed being down and doing my 1 minute, and he was always there dressed very dapper, and I told him multiple times if I had his wardrobe, I would have burned mine. So he will be missed. Mr. Brown, would you agree that pipelines are the safest mode of transportation for natural gas and petroleum products?
When you factor in the volume of product moved, I would say so. Obviously, the discussion here today involved a lot of tragic incidents, and so for those individuals, it certainly is not. But when you just talk about it in the context of volume.
Overall, yes, sir. I mean, there's an immense number that is moved. Would you agree that these pipelines provide a lot of jobs and opportunities for some very hardworking Americans?
There are a lot of jobs associated with the pipeline sector.
And it is hard work. It's not an easy kind of thing.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that as well?
Could you repeat that?
I said it, yeah, they shut the door on me. They do that a lot of times on me. Would you agree that this is very hard work?
It is very hard work. Yes, I've been out there, and we've got the best workers in the world.
Yes, we do. And thank you for saying that. According to the Liquid Energy Pipeline Association, pipelines are the most environmentally protective way to deliver energy. Earlier this year, the Biden administration halted new export permits for liquefied natural gas because of climate change. Did you or anyone at the Department of Transportation tell President Biden this was an unwise decision?
I did not have any involvement in the pause that the Department of Energy recently announced.
Would you say it's not y'all's responsibility at TDOT?
We do not have any jurisdiction in that space, no.
Okay. I said TDOT. I'm used to saying that, Tennessee Department of Transportation. Always. Yeah. That's where I usually direct most of my anger at. According to DOT's website, you serve on President Biden's carbon dioxide capture task force. moving forward, when the federal government makes decisions regarding liquefied natural gas, I hope that we put American people first and not these ridiculous climate initiatives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back 2 minutes and 34 seconds. Please use it wisely.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. DeSaulnier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. I'll start with Mr. Brown and transition to anyone else who'd like to address this, sort of a good segue from my colleague. And in the context of the times changing, I represent an area in the San Francisco Bay Area that is the densest in terms of hazardous materials because of refineries and chemical plants in the proximity of one of the few deepwater ports of the West Coast. So it's changing, and a lot of it's because of our policy in California that I firmly support and been leading for many years. But we don't focus as much collectively, I don't think, on your issues around the transportation, around the refineries and the chemical plants. And the question, Mr. Brown, is of those used to be 6 refineries, there are now 5. One of them shut. 2 of them have been shut down for extended period of time to transition to biofuels as the California Renewable Portfolio Standard continues to be implemented and the market changes for their product. So how do we work with the private sector and anticipate, and to your point about resources and transparency, how do we make these numbers as transparent as possible and the oversight and inspections as transparent as possible so that we actually are more efficient as we look at the marketplace change? Not a comment on, well, our energy resources in California are changing dramatically. We're leading the country. We're proud of that. It's more efficient, if you ask me, even separate from the issues of the damage to the planet. So how does your agency, and I'll leave these, we have a diverse panel to talk about that, about being fairly agnostic as to what my colleague was just talking about, but also being driven by evidence-based research on how we transition, allow the local community transition as they see fit, consistent with state statute. And again, if you look at a map of the area I represent, there are just red lines of hazardous materials, pipelines all over. And then compared to rail and truck transport for these facilities, and a lot of them think they're going to be producing hydrogen for many decades to come. So they're going to still need that infrastructure. But the transition seems to me, if we get it right, would be really efficient and transparent, and everyone could follow it. But if we don't, there's going to continue to be risk to the public and to the national economy. And again, lastly, as a Pacific Rim part of the dynamic, our competitors in China, as they change more dramatically than we do, and they have certain advantages in their access to raw materials, how do we look at the comparisons and the global changing thing in terms of transport? We get a lot of our fuel that's refined in the Bay Area still from the North Slope, which is very heavy crude and requires transport that is specific to that product, both going into the plant and coming out of it.
Well, I couldn't agree more. The transparency is really critical at this stage. And we're in an age of data where there's just so much data that didn't exist years ago. And so voluntarily sharing that information, that's something our agency tries to do. We report on our website all of our incident data, enforcement data, which is somewhat unique for government agencies. But also we recently mapped incidents across the country, and we're continuing to do that to provide direct data on the types of incidents that are occurring so that academics or the public can engage. And I know the Pipeline Safety Trust has been, that's been a big focus of theirs as part of the reauthorization legislation and voluntary information sharing system. We've voluntarily tried to create a space for when an incident occurs, a sharing of that information so that other operators can learn from that. I know Ms. Sames' organization provides an audit of companies voluntarily, but basically opening the books and sharing information and acknowledging where risks exist helps us all try to tackle those risks collectively.
Mr. Rohr, could you respond to having worked with the Western States Petroleum Association, and they described it once as a love-hate relationship that may have changed more to the latter.
Yeah,
Your industry's changing a lot.
It is, and we very much view ourselves as both part of the solution for technological advances for current activities that we're doing on oil and natural gas, but then also in the transition, we're going to be part of that as well. I couldn't agree with the Deputy Administrator that regular engagement, transparency wherever we can. It doesn't mean we agree all the time, but certainly the collaboration, the coordination wherever we can is absolutely critical. I think you appropriately identified the interaction, the dependency, if you will, that you have on the North Slope crude. So it has to be more than just pipelines. We have to make sure that we recognize that the infrastructure system is intertwined and complicated, so coordination across federal agencies and even between the states is critical as well.
And transparency.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Molinaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad Mr. Brown referenced the need to share data as it relates to safety concerns. One provision that we were able to include in the PHMSA reauthorization from this body, and I'm very grateful in a bipartisan way, again, this committee produced an outcome. The House, of course, produced an outcome, and we're still waiting on the Senate to take action, which for many of us is not only concerning, it's just a consistent waste of time and resources when there's major advancements that need to happen. But one provision we did include that I helped draft in the reauthorization bill passed in December with my colleague, Mr. Cohen, was the creation of voluntary information sharing system. This would allow and encourage the sharing of pipeline safety data and information. We did that with the industry. And Mr. Brown referenced the value of this kind of sharing data. I was not going to start with this question, but it seems to me if any of the other witnesses could speak to the value of that, it would, I think, highlight the need to move the bill forward.
So the voluntary information sharing system, as we discussed a little bit earlier, it could be incredibly valuable if it's designed appropriately. And what I mean by that is so long as the information that's submitted to the federal agencies are protected, and then the information is used in such a manner where it would allow companies a level of comfort that information, there's no reach back authority in a punitive fashion. Of course. Then you would get great participation. It would give us a great data set to not only look at trends, but then also identify individual reportings so that we can share the lessons learned more broadly across the industry.
And I fully agree. I mean, we do something similar within the American Gas Association. We have a plastic pipe database. It has over 150,000 failures. It's evaluated by government and industry and manufacturers. And we create a status report about 3 times a year showing what we know about failures. And it works. So if this is done correctly, it now gives you this wealth of information that the industry and government can utilize to improve safety. On the other hand, if it's done incorrectly, if there's fines and penalties for the submission, no one's going to submit.
Agreed. And another provision I drafted and we were able to secure in the reauthorization with my colleague, Mr. Allred, directs PHMSA to complete a study and rulemaking on how operators can use composite pipe safely to transport new fuels like hydrogen that will help us meet some of our climate goals. Mr. Rohr, could you just speak to the potential uses for composite pipe and why it's important to get this rulemaking accomplished?
Yes, sir. So as we discussed with Representative Desanier, we're part of the solution going forward, and we certainly see hydrogen as having a role there. Composite pipe's been used for decades now for repair jobs and sleeves, et cetera. So that piece of technology in particular stands to be of particular benefit as we talk about moving greater quantities of hydrogen.
Thank you. Thank you both. Just to shift gears slightly, I've spent my entire life in the Hudson River Valley, which means just by birth we're natural resource conservationists, but it always strikes me as a bit comical that there are those who oppose the construction of pipelines for the safe transportation of CO2 and natural gas and other fuels, given that greenhouse gas emissions are avoided altogether transporting via pipeline rather than other more traditional transportation methods. Mr. Karam, could you just speak a little bit to that? I always like to remind my friends back in New York why some of the regulatory restrictions in New York for pipeline and the distribution via pipelines is probably not the best policy.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Rather than, so rulemaking in states like New York limit, and of course, there are those who oppose the use of pipeline for transportation of CO2, natural gas, as instead relying on the alternative transport options, which usually lead to higher greenhouse gas emissions.
Gotcha, yes. I think, there are certainly lower incident rates on pipelines per mile, as Deputy Administrator Brown referenced earlier. I think one thing that gets missed in that data is just how devastating a failure can be from a pipeline just because of the quantity that is released when there is a failure on a pipeline. And so I think that needs to be taken into account. But my organization works very hard on ensuring the safety of pipelines that are in the ground, and making sure that the pipeline that's in someone's backyard is as safe as possible, and that the community around it can feel that, not live in fear of a failure.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Graves, who does not serve on this committee, but he was waived on this subcommittee. So you have 5 minutes, Mr. Graves. Good to see you.
You too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Brown, I want to follow up on Congressman Burchett's question. The National Research Council did an evaluation looking at different modes of transportation. Congressman Burchett asked you a question related to that. So I just want to make sure I understand. Are pipelines the safest mode of transportation when compared to other modes?
It's sort of a complicated question, but I think to your point, as far as the fewest number of incidents, if you look at the volume, you'd say yes, but to Mr. Karam's point, the severity of an incident can be tragic and obviously very severe.
I absolutely agree with that. I want to make sure I understand my reading of the National Research Council's evaluation that compared to truck and train and barge and other things, it is the safest mode of transportation.
Yes.
We should never stop striving to further and further improve safety. I want to be clear on that. Do you agree that the state of California uses oil and gas?
Yes, I've used it in the state of California.
Thought so. I'm not sure I understand why some folks will sit here and talk about pipelines as this evil whenever their state uses it. Science shows it is the safest mode of transportation. Let me be clear. I agree that we need to continue striving, using technology, get better and better at safety and perfecting this. But let's compare this to alternatives. I was just looking, I pulled up an article just for the city of New York, just for the city of New York. According to the Fire Department of New York in 2023, lithium-ion batteries caused 267 fires, 150 injuries, and 18 deaths. That is just in New York, just in 2023. We can't sit here and pretend like that by stopping pipelines, there are all these other alternatives that are that much better. That doesn't even include the fact that many of the energy solutions that my friends from California are talking about include mining that have been proven, as Mr. Stauber has talked about. Slave labor, child labor, safety infractions, deaths across the globe. So I think we need to be very thoughtful and careful about pretending as though there are all of these other safer, better options out there, and instead focus on what math and science shows are the safest options, and make sure we're continuing to learn from successes and failures and continue to perfect. Is that fair?
That's exactly what our agency does, because we also regulate the hazardous materials transportation via truck, train, plane, vessel, automobile, and drone.
Sounds like it's the first time you've ever said that. Thank you. I appreciate it. Mr. Rourke, I'd like to ask you a question. PHMSA hasn't really made substantial changes in some of the class location regulations in over 50 years. Can you talk a little bit about how perhaps some updates or modernization there could result in actual better safety outcomes?
Yes, sir. So the class location rules, the way they're currently designed in an outdated fashion, essentially says that once a certain population is reached, that companies automatically have to pull those pipelines out, regardless of whether or not they're safe or they need to be pulled out. First and foremost, we look out for the workers of the communities in which we out for the safety for the communities in which we operate in, but also for the workers that do our work. So if we can avoid doing work where we don't have to, particularly with heavy machinery, we want to do that. Secondly, if we can use existing technologies, integrity management technologies, to maintain the same level of safety, and oftentimes find pipelines that don't need to be pulled out. We don't need to purge that gas and spend hundreds of millions of dollars pulling out pipe unnecessarily that we can then redivert to integrity management programs. And then lastly, sir, I would say that that annually the amount of gas that occurs from blowdowns just to do these pipe replacements it exceeds 800 million standard cubic feet of natural gas a year, which is the same amount of gas that 10,000 homes use. If we can avoid that and still maintain the same level of safety.
Could prevent the emissions. Another quick question, and I apologize, I'm running out of time, but could you talk briefly about the regulation of in-plant pipelines as opposed to those external to the boundaries?
Yeah, so when the statute was originally created, it was very specific in giving PHMSA the authority to waive its authority over in-plant piping for liquid pipelines, but it didn't provide the same level of clarity for natural gas pipelines. What we would look to see, or hope to see, is a harmonization so that PHMSA has that same level of authority to let OSHA, which currently manages the refineries, have that same authority over the natural gas.
In some cases, we're seeing regional PHMSA managers exercise jurisdiction whenever PHMSA has headquarters effectively.
Yes, sir, and it's starting to create some confusion in the industry.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but I just want to thank you. Mr. Brown, I'm concerned about what Mr. Rausser brought up about some of the deadlines in the law. I don't think your agency has the discretion to determine when they're going to complete something. If we write a law, our citizens don't have the ability to choose when they're going to comply and when they don't, and I think we need to work on better strategies to actually comply. I'm out of time. I apologize. Yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Brown, pipelines often route hazardous materials through densely populated areas, which can become public safety emergencies in the event of a pipeline failure. In some events, communities are not made aware of pipelines until something goes wrong. What obligation do pipeline operators have to inform the public about location and likely risks of pipelines?
We have a host of requirements that we impose on those operators to inform. So there are signage requirements, there's emergency planning requirements, emergency notification requirements, and those we're constantly updating. Just last year, in 2022, we updated those. We're working on further updates as well. So that is something that we stay very focused on for precisely the reasons you mentioned.
Thank you. Are pipeline operators required to hold public meetings after a pipeline incident?
No, and that's something we've really taken on as an agency. When the public doesn't have the information, a serious incident occurs in their community, we've tried to provide information that we have, but of course, we don't operate the pipeline. We only oversee the operations. And so that's something that I think an operator, when there is an incident that affects a community, that they should communicate to the community and give a chance to the community to ask those types of questions.
Thank you. Mr. Karam, the Bipartisan Pipeline Safety Reauthorization Bill focuses on the safety of the millions of miles of gas and hazardous liquid pipelines that are currently in use and the new pipelines required for hydrogen and carbon dioxide. The bill asks for a study by the Government Accountability Office on the need and ability to create a localized emergency alert system in the event of pipeline accidents. What information is needed for first responders when responding to a pipeline incident?
Yeah, the type of pipeline failed, the product that was in the pipeline that failed, the potential impacted area of that failure, which homes and places could be impacted by that failure. What kind of emergency efforts are best? Is it shelter in place? Is it an evacuation? And I think the need for such a system is made even more by CO2 pipelines because they can move so far away from a pipeline, the plume after a failure, because sometimes people should evacuate and sometimes maybe they should shelter in place, and it's not a kind of one-size-fits-all. The weather affects what direction it could move, things like that.
Is the information needed by first responders that you just outlined, is that information always readily available, and where is it obtained from?
It's not always readily available. Some of that information about the type of pipeline it is and some physical characteristics of the pipeline and the location can be found on the National Pipeline Mapping System, but other information that might be particular to that specific failure would not be, and first responders would need to rely on communication from the operators to get that kind of information. And I think that the two Denbury failures, one in Satartia and one in Sulphur, shows what can happen when there's a breakdown there.
Thank you. Engaging with local communities and stakeholders is crucial to raising awareness about pipeline safety risks and also building trust in pipeline operators and regulators. The Pipes Act of 2023 even creates a new Office of Public Engagement to educate local governments, public safety organizations, pipeline operators, and the public about pipeline safety best practices and regulations. The goal is to ensure access to information by facilitating conversations and addressing community concerns. To promote transparency and accountability, how you are able to bridge the gaps, or how are you able to bridge the gaps between industry stakeholders, including public safety officials, smaller companies, and local communities?
Well, I think there's still a big need for public engagement, especially after failures. I think PHMSA has made some real improvements there over the last few years and has visited communities both after a failure and where there's a proposed new project. And that's been great to see, but I think there's a lot of progress still to be made, and there's definitely an appetite for it from the public.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Are there any further questions from any members of the committee that have not been recognized? See none, this concludes our hearing today. I want to thank you all for being here today. Look forward to Mr. Brown, any questions that need to be answered. I hope you can be timely with that in the next couple of weeks. You should be able to do so. This committee stands adjourned.